Hey guys, today we are talking about one of the most powerful weapons at your disposal for coloring your sound, and that's EQ. It's one of the most powerful weapons we have, but it's also one of the most misunderstood and misapplied. So let's get right at this. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. What is EQ? EQ is manipulating frequencies to get a different sound, and I like to use the word color, to get a different color or texture, that sort of sound. And if we want brighter, darker, thicker, thinner, rounder, sharper, those types of things, colors and textures, if we're looking to change that about our sound, EQ is almost certainly the tool. Now, we're not going to get into the science today, like weird, right? I'm usually a science guy. We've got some other videos that I'm going to put up a link to that are going to dig more into the technical aspects and more of the science behind. Today is going to be a lot more practical application. In the spectrum of human hearing, we tend to use like three main regions to discuss the sounds that we can hear: highs, mids, and lows. So you're going to hear that a lot. Highs are going to be like all the sparkly, bright, where intelligibility is, any of the scratching, any of those kind of things are high frequency sound. Mids are sort of where all of our notes are. Where the human voice is, where the notes, the fundamental tones of your violin, viola, cello, where those notes are, we would call that the mids. And then lows is a thing that bowed string players, apart from like extended range cellists or bass players, don't really deal with much unless we're using octave down pitch shifters. Okay, we don't get that low for the most part. Now, all of these frequencies are a double-edged sword. They're good or they're bad, right? So too much of a good thing. With highs are where we get our intelligibility, our clarity, our sparkle, our air. That's where all those things are. You're like, well, those are all good things. We want those. Right. But if we have too much of those things, then it's harsh, it's brittle, it's bitey. If you've ever heard a mix where it's like, it feels like somebody's jamming an ice pick into my eardrum, that's because of highs, right? So highs are good, but too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. So we have to kind of find the sweet spot. Same kind of deal with mids. If mids are where like pressure and warmth and depth, fullness, those are where the mids are. Too little of that, you don't have any warmth, you don't have any depth, it's a little thin and weak, but too much is it's muddy. It's muddy and it's garbled. So we got to find the sweet spot in our mids too. With lows, if they don't have any lows, there's just no foundation to the sound. But if there's too much, it can get woofy, and then you can get a roar, sort of that feedback roar that you'll hear sometimes. I would love to give you the ideal settings for a string instrument. But anytime you're cooking and they're like, hey, salt, garlic, pepper, all these things, they say season to taste. And it's because each person's taste buds are different. Each dish is different. Each expectation is different. EQ is like that. It is 100% context dependent. I cannot tell you how to EQ your instrument until I'm in a room with you, listening to it in context with the other people you're going to play with at concert volume. That's the only time I can give any EQ advice, is if I'm in that situation. It is completely dependent on the instrument, the amp, the effects, the ensemble, the room. Each person's ears are going to have a preference, and of course the overall volume. Let's talk about overall volume for a second. All of your equipment is volume dependent. As you turn it up, not only does the volume go up, the tone changes, the timbre changes. And that's because there's no such thing as a perfect linear amplifier. When we spend a lot of money on gear, we start getting closer and closer to linearity, but there's still no such thing as a perfectly linear amp. When you turn it up, it's going to sound not only louder, but also different. A lot of your effects are that way. And your ears are 100% that way. Even if we had a perfect linear amp, it would not sound perfectly linear to you, because human ears can hear certain frequencies better than others at different volumes. The louder we get, the better our ears can hear all frequencies. But when we get real quiet, there are certain frequencies that sort of spike on us, and it's mostly highs. It's mostly in that 3 to 5K range The human ear is very, very sensitive to those, even at low volume. So if you're trying to EQ your violin at room volume and then you go to a concert and turn up, it's not going to sound the same. So I always start with first principles. We start with the instrument and then we work through the chain. Okay. So as I'm doing all this stuff, I want my volume wide open on my violin, unless it's a Barbera pickup and I keep it at 80% because it sweetens it up some. Or if it's a Yamaha YEV, I keep them at around 50% because they're so loud they can actually overdrive some of your pedals. And I start, if your violin has a tone knob, I leave that centered, halfway between all the way down and all the way up. And then, of course, we want our amp at performance volume so that the amp sounds like it's going to sound and your ears are hearing what you're going to hear. In general, with EQ, less is more. If you find yourself doing all kinds of crazy stuff with EQ, that's probably bad. You probably have a problem other than your EQ setting. I will say, in general, subtractive EQ is better than additive. And here's how that works out. If you're saying, I really need more highs in my violin, so I'm going to turn up the highs. So I want the highs to be louder in relation to all the other sound. What if we turn the mids down? And that's going to make the highs higher in relation to those mids, and it's going to subtract EQ rather than adding. And there's reasons for this, but just right now, practical application, subtractive is better than additive as a general principle. Not always the case, good general principle. Also, in an ensemble, you have to blend. You cannot all occupy the same space. If I tell you, hey, here's the EQ setting for your violin, and you copy and paste to the other 5 violins that you're playing with, that's bad. Why is that? In a concert, I've got 4 people in my string quartet, and they all sort of have very similar instruments, and they sound great. Yeah, because you have 4 point sources in the room. When you start to amplify, everything's now coming through one speaker. And the human ear is really, really location dependent. If I hear all 4 sounds coming out of one speaker, that's going to sound different than if I've got 4 separate speakers. And I'm have to fight a whole lot harder if I've got everybody with the same EQ going through the same speaker. It's a big problem. So let's get into the mechanics of how we actually EQ. And we're going to go in order of your signal chain, starting with the instrument, into the preamp, into your pedals, not just your EQ pedals, but all your other pedals, your amp, and front of house. FOH is front of house, which means the soundboard, who's controlling the sound out front. So start with the instrument. Some instruments have a tone knob. That tone knob, turning it up makes your instrument sound brighter, crispier. Turning it down is going to make it sound darker and thicker, but less cutting, right? So if you want to cut through a mix, you want to turn up your tone knob. If it's a little harsh for you, you can turn it down. So we start with the instrument and get it sounding as good as we can before we move on to the next thing. And generally, I would have everything else, all my other EQ knobs centered before I do that. When we get to the preamp, most preamps have an EQ section. There's some really common knobs where they'll say high or treble. They may say mid, bass. And then there's 2 we haven't talked about. There's a presence and a notch. Presence is generally between mids and highs. And then notch, the rest of these knobs are fairly wide. When you turn up a knob that says mids on it, it's actually going to raise your sound in a number of frequencies. It's actually a bell-shaped curve. It's a pretty wide curve. So it doesn't have any real surgical sound to it, but it's nice and smooth and general. A notch filter we would use if we have a particularly problematic frequency. If there's one frequency that's feeding back, or there's one frequency that's just really poking out, we would use the notch filter. We would turn down that notch, which means it's lowering the level. And then there's generally a frequency sweep knob somewhere where we've got that notch down now. Now we want to move it in the sonic spectrum to find where that problematic area is. It's a little more involved, but I just wanted you to know what that filter is and what it's there for. Now, the next thing after your preamp, if you've got an EQ pedal, a lot of people will buy these like GE7 pedals where it's got the 7 little faders on it. That's called a graphic EQ versus a band EQ that's got like the 3 knobs, highs, mids, lows. A graphic EQ has finer control, which is good and bad. if we have some problematic frequencies, the graphic EQ is great for finding those. If we're trying to make sweeping changes, the graphic EQ could get you in a little trouble if you start notching 1 or 2 frequencies here and there. It can start putting kind of some sonic holes in your sound, and it can sound pretty unnatural. So unless you've got a problematic frequency, I generally try to get those faders on there to make a nice smooth curve. Okay? Now we get to the amp. This allows you to sculpt tone at the end of your signal chain. This is after you sort of already worked through your signal chain and got the best sound that you can to there. It makes wide general changes. This is one of those sort of things that we would call more like a global setting. Because as you change, each one of your effects pedals will usually have a tone knob on it. And that pedal, you can sort of dial in the EQ of that particular effect that you have. The amp, once we get there, that's at the end of your signal chain, unless you're using an effects loop, and then it might not be at the end of your signal chain. You have to look at the block diagram for your amp. But that would be sort of a global setting, and we would get to that next to last. And that's where I sort of feel like my responsibility for my tone ends, is at my amp. Okay, so once I've got my amp doing what sounds good to me, the next place it goes is to front of house. And this is your sound engineer. All this is outside of your control at this point. So you want to send a nice, warm sound, the sort of thing that you're looking for. You want to send that to your front of house person, and then you let the engineer sort of fit it into the mix and tailor it into the room. And this is where communication is going to be key. If you're working with an engineer who has not mixed a lot of strings before, just talk to him or talk to her about what your hope or your expectation is. And ask them, hey, if you start making a lot of EQ changes, come talk to me because I may be able to do something here. If they come to you and say, hey man, it's too harsh, it's too bright for the room and for the ensemble, well then maybe I can make some changes here that I've got a little more control over, and I can make sure that that's happening. So just communicate with your engineers. Please do that. All right, so where do I EQ in my signal chain? EQ is like voting. We want to do it early and often, right? That's the old joke about voting, early and often. So each step in the chain, the earlier in the chain you can do it, the better. But each one of your pedals, like I said, will typically have a tone knob or something like that. So make sure you're sculpting that tone at each step of the way, and use subtractive EQ when you can, and just be prepared to tweak every night. Every night is going to be different. If you have a lot of people in the crowd, it's going to sound different out front than if you're playing to an empty house. If it's cold, it's going to sound different. If you're change your violin, if you're in a different ensemble, it's going to be different. Little tweaks are going to be different every night. So just make sure that you're prepared to do that. Now, I'm a sound engineer. What do I do when I'm mixing violin? I'm going to give you some general advice, although I want to say that this all has to be taken with a grain of salt because it is 100% context dependent. One of the first things I will do when I'm mixing a violin is I'll set the HPF, the high pass filter, at about 200 hertz, especially if it's a 4-string violin. So we did a video on high pass filters. If you have questions about that, you can refer to that video. And then I will generally be prepared to start cutting between 3 and 5K, is where sort of if you've got a piezo pickup, which is what most pickups are on electric violins, they can get a little pushy at that frequency in that 3 to 5K range. So I'm usually prepared to start cutting there. I'm going to listen first. I don't salt my food before I eat it. I don't start EQing things before I hear them. But that's generally where I would be. And then I just sort of listen for any frequencies that are poking out. Are there any frequencies that like, man, that one frequency just kind of doesn't sound right? I'll try to find it and try to get it down. And then I listen for things that are fighting for space in the mix. If it sounds like, man, the violin and the lead vocal, they're fighting each other and I can't hear either one of them as well as I want to, I'm going to scoop one of them out to make space for the other one. And as a string player, I got bad news for you. I'm not scooping the vocalist. I'm scooping you. So make sure that when you're playing, you're not trying to occupy the same space as somebody else. This is where engineers start carving violin tone out, and violinists get really mad. Well, he pulled all my mids out. Well, why? Why did he do that? It's probably not because he's deaf. It's probably not because he hates you. It may be because you're trying to occupy the same space as somebody else. So sometimes that's on us as players to make better decisions about what and when we play rather than blaming somebody else. And then the other thing I do, again, context is everything. I have to listen with my ears before I make any changes. It's like you don't season your food before you taste it. Same kind of thing. The other thing, if I'm making major adjustments, if I'm pulling more than 5 dB out of any given frequency range, I'm asking myself why that is. I may have a source issue. There may be that, if I'm miking a violin, maybe the mic's not in a good place. Maybe I'm not using the right mic. Maybe I got a crappy sounding violin. I don't know. But if I'm making major adjustments in EQ, I'm going to try to figure out why that has to be. A violin, we shouldn't have to do a ton of EQ to a violin. If we do, something's probably wrong. And then the other thing, the guy that taught me about sound, he goes, Matt, it's a knob, man. Turn it. You're not going to hurt anything. Turn the knob. Just experiment. I don't know what highs do. We'll turn them all the way up. And if they sound bad, turn them the other way. So experimentation is a thing. It's totally cool. You're not going to hurt anything by experimenting with EQ. You might cause some feedback. That might actually hurt. But generally, you're not going to break anything by experimenting with EQ. Just do it. Have some fun. There's no substitute for training your ears to hear the things that they need to hear. Okay? So, this concludes our lesson on the application of EQ. So, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can check out some other videos here. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.